Did you know? Capcom was so impressed with director Hideki Kamiya's work on Resident Evil 2 that the company assigned Kamiya to direct Resident Evil 3 as well. This early version of Resident Evil 3 was set to star Hunk chasing down a sample of the G virus on a luxury cruise liner. However, after hearing news of Sony's much more powerful PlayStation 2 launching at the turn of the millennium, Kamiya decided to ditch the PlayStation 1 and turn his attention towards the next generation console. Kamiya stated, "I think Resident Evil 2 represents everything I would be able to achieve for a survival horror game on the PlayStation. My vision for the next game was to make something brand new and more provoking. As a result, I decided to make Resident Evil 3 for the PlayStation 2. Afterwards, another Resident Evil game was greenlit for Sega's Dreamcast. Although Capcom intended the game to be a follow-up to Resident Evil 2's storyline, the company decided against naming the game Resident Evil 3 and gave it the subtitle Code Veronica instead. Yoshiki Okamoto, Capcom's general manager at the time, stated, "The idea at the time was to keep numbered games on Sony systems and use different names for games made for Sega and Nintendo. However, Capcom became nervous that Kamiya's Resident Evil 3 would take too long to develop, especially with the ever-growing number of survival horror games hitting the market. Capcom quickly decided they should act fast to keep the lead, and greenlit another Resident Evil game for the PS1, which became known internally as Resident Evil 1.9. While Resident Evil 1 and 2 were huge projects with big budgets and longer development cycles, Capcom had no such luxuries with this next entry. Since a new console generation was quickly approaching, Capcom demanded that 1.9 be completed in a single year before the PS1 became irrelevant. To make matters worse, many Resident Evil staff members were committed to other bigger next-gen projects, so 1.9's team was largely staffed by less experienced employees and freelancers. Capcom turned to Kazuhiro Aoyama, a system planner for the first two Resident Evil games, to direct 1.9. Meanwhile, series writer Noboru Sugimura was busy with other projects, so Aoyama needed a new writer to take the reins. Director of the original Resident Evil and producer of Resident Evil 2, Shinji Mikami, took a chance and hired Yasuhisa Kawamura for the job. This decision surprised even Kawamura, who had no experience writing for video games. In fact, Kawamura's only writing experience at the time was a novelization of a Battle Angel Alita manga series that failed to take off. To make matters worse, Kawamura fumbled the job interview, or so he thought. Kawamura recalled, "They first asked me what kind of game I wanted to make. I said, I want to make an Exorcist-themed Resident Evil game, or a Yakuza-themed Resident Evil with katana swords. I looked back at how I behaved after my interview and I assumed that I was disqualified. Later, I found out I was offered the position. As luck would have it, Kawamura, a Kempo enthusiast, picked up a martial arts magazine on his way to the job interview and brought it with him. Mikami noticed the magazine and asked Kawamura about it during the interview. As it turned out, Mikami practiced Kempo during his college years, which helped win him over." The name Resident Evil 1.9 reflected Aoyama and Kawamura's idea for the game to be a prequel to Resident Evil 2 rather than a sequel. Originally, the story was planned to follow 3 mercenaries hired by the Umbrella Corporation and would lead into the zombie apocalypse of Raccoon City, ending moments before Leon and Claire arrive on the scene. This direction was partially made out of necessity, as it allowed the team to freely reuse Resident Evil 2's game engine and setting to save on time and resources. However, Aoyama didn't want to simply rest on Resident Evil 2's laurels and set out to enhance the gameplay however he could. Aoyama had personally directed Resident Evil 2's The Fourth Survivor mode, a timed gauntlet minigame where players rushed through a horde of zombies with limited supplies, and sought to create an even more action-packed game with 1.9. This called for various improvements, such as copious aggressive enemies, dodging mechanics, a quick 180 turn, and the ability to craft new ammo and different ammunition types. Aoyama also decided to cut the game back to only feature a single scenario rather than 2. To make up for there being only a single campaign, item locations and puzzle solutions were randomized to give the game more replayability. Meanwhile, Kawamura took his idea a step further with the creation of the live selection feature, which gave players the ability to choose how the story played out at key sections of the game. Yet again, the team still needed to cut back more to release the game on time and within budget, so the number of bosses was drastically cut back to only 2. However, its main boss, Nemesis, was given a much greater role to compensate, able to haunt players throughout the game. Interestingly, Nemesis was initially planned to be a blob-like creature, similar to the titular monster from the 1958 cult horror film The Blob, but it was ultimately reworked into the seemingly unstoppable tyrant we know today, inspired by the likes of the T-1000 from Terminator 2 Judgment Day. The next change in development came with a story revision in the concurrently made Resident Evil Code Veronica, which was planned to use Jill Valentine, but left her out in favor of a new character. With a fan-favorite character now up for grabs, the decision was made to put Jill into Resident Evil 1.9. The game's storyline now followed Jill's trek through Raccoon City, directly preceding the events of Resident Evil 2, before skipping ahead to the city's fate after Leon and Claire's escape. With this development, the game became internally dubbed Resident Evil 1.9 plus 2.1. However, the complicated name didn't stick, and the heads at Capcom decided to title the game Resident Evil 3 Nemesis in spring of 1999. Although the game had always been closely tied to Resident Evil 2, Capcom's decision to make the project the official successor caught Aoyama's team completely off guard. Aoyama stated, "This game was supposed to be a spin-off, so I stuck to that framework during development. I was not expecting it to become Resident Evil 3 at all." Both Aoyama and Mikami feared the newly dubbed Resident Evil 3's smaller scope and focus on action would leave fans disappointed. However, with just a few months left before the game's scheduled release, and Capcom's unwillingness to delay the project any further, the team had no choice but to press on and expand the game as much and as quickly as possible. The game was originally set at the end of the clock tower after a final battle with Nemesis for an estimated playthrough time of 2 to 3 hours, but Okamoto demanded the game be lengthened. Old areas were expanded to feature new rooms and completely new areas, such as the Dead Factory and the Raccoon City Park, which were added during the game's last 2 months of development. This final crunch period was so intense that some of the developers' wives filed missing person reports after their husbands failed to return home. They were actually just toiling away at the office day after day to complete the game on time. In spite of the extreme workload, Kawamura still found the energy to come up with more additions to the game, such as the Mercenaries minigame, inspired by his personal favorite movie, 1987's The Running Man. Unfortunately, not every one of Kawamura's ideas were able to be finished in time, including a mode where players could control a zombified Brad Vickers. Aoyama's team held their breath as Resident Evil 3 hit store shelves, but despite their concerns, the game flew off store shelves. It managed to sell over 1 million copies within its first week in Japan, and sold exceedingly well in the West too, ultimately selling 3.5 million copies worldwide. Although the game failed to beat its predecessor's sales, Resident Evil 3's low budget and quick development actually worked in Capcom's favor. In fact, Mikami estimates that Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was the most profitable game in the series up to that point. Fast forward over 20 years, and Capcom confirmed rumors that a Resident Evil 3 remake was on track for an April 2020 release, just 14 months after the Resident Evil 2 remake. In fact, this marks the first time 2 mainline Resident Evil games have been released in such quick succession since the Resident Evil 1 remake and Resident Evil 0 were both released on the GameCube in 2002. This quick turnaround is thanks to the Resident Evil 3 remake being in development for a while. Producer Pete Fabiano explained, "The Resident Evil 2 remake started development first, but one thing to clarify is that when we decided it was the right time to work on that game, we knew that we wanted to remake Resident Evil 3 as well because it would essentially tie up the trilogy. The Resident Evil 3 remake has been in development for 3 years itself, most of it directly alongside its predecessor. In fact, development of the Resident Evil 2 remake directly impacted the Resident Evil 3 team's work, especially in regards to Nemesis." Fabiano stated, "Resident Evil 3 remake director Kiyohiko Sakata looked at what they had done with Mr. X in the Resident Evil 2 remake and was like, wait a minute, they've Nemesis-ified him. So it was like taking it that one step further. We needed to make Nemesis ferocious and a real threat, and I think you'll feel that when you play the game." The Resident Evil 2 remake even had a small nod to the Resident Evil 3 remake following its official announcement in December 2019. As of the Resident Evil 2 Remake's 1.05 update, players can now find a note inside Kendo's gun shop which reads, "Kendo, it seems like you've got your reasons for staying put, so I'll trust you to take care of yourself. Still, if things get worse and your other arrangements don't work out, you know where to find me. I'll do everything I can. Jill Valentine." Reading the letter grants the new achievement, Chasing Jill, which includes an image of Jill and Kendo that cannot be found otherwise within the game. Even though both games share an engine, the Resident Evil 3 Remake's development team didn't settle for just repeating what the Resident Evil 2 Remake achieved in 2019. For instance, zombies' movement speed, animations, attacks, and AI have all been overhauled, and the emergency dodge feature has been further improved. Raccoon City has been built from the ground up, including reimagined areas from the original game, as well as new areas including shops, sewer segments, and more to allow for much more exploration than before. The story and its cast have been reworked and expanded as well. Jill was given special attention in particular. Fabiano told IGN, "Sakata really wanted to show that Jill is a character that has the wherewithal to get through all situations. At its core, it's survival horror, right? And we want to keep those elements in there and show that Jill can get through these really hard situations." Jill's new design, based on Russian model Sasha Zatova, was specifically created to reflect this design shift. Unfortunately, not everything from the original game will return in the remake. Namely, both the Mercenaries mode and the live selection feature have been axed. While the Mercenaries mode was replaced with the Resident Evil Resistance asymmetrical multiplayer game, cutting the live selection feature was a tough call, according to Sakata. Nevertheless, the decision was made in hopes of the game being a more cohesive experience than the original game. Did you also know that the German version of Super Smash Bros. Melee, Popo's name was changed to Pepe, or that the English version of F-Zero GX was censored in multiple places? For more facts, check out the DidYouKnowGaming video on GameCube secrets and censorship.